So welcome to the Oxford Sustainable Finance Group's first public event of 2022. I'm Ben Caldecott, I direct the group, and I'll be chairing the proceedings this evening. So this is, I think, maybe the second time I've given a lecture in person to people. Well, I'm not giving a lecture, actually. First time I've stood up in front of people since COVID. Great to see people in person. Wonderful that people are convening once again. And we've got an ambitious series of in-person and hybrid events over the next few months, over the summer in particular. So I'm hoping this event whets your appetite. I'm hoping as a result you register for some of those things coming up. Do have a look at our website. So for those of you who don't know the group, we were founded simply to align finance and investment with global environmental sustainability. Not exactly a small task, and a big one, an important one, an exciting one, and one of the reasons many of you will be here today and coming to our things. And we try and do that by defining best practice, what good looks like, and also by mainstreaming that good practice. And we do that through a very wide variety of different projects, programs, initiatives, and we also do that through teaching, capacity building, convening. And we do this not only in Oxford, but also around the world. And I think we're unusual in the breadth and depth of our capabilities, and this is partly enabled by the fact that we're a large team. We'll be approaching 40 people, research staff, over the summer, and that's being supported as a result of a variety of different partnerships with research councils, with financial institutions, with philanthropy. But this breadth and depth is also enabled by the fact we're in a global research university, and that means we can collaborate closely with colleagues working not just in the social sciences but also in the natural and physical sciences too. So lots of exciting things going on in the group. Happy to talk to people about that, and if you want to get involved in what we're doing, please find me or find my colleagues. And I've got quite a few colleagues here. I think they're all clustered somewhere over there. Do you want to put your hands up if you're in the group? They are all, indeed all clustered over there. All right, so if there's a COVID breakout later, then I've got to figure out. Anyway, find them. So today's event was actually originally supposed to happen in April 2020, and for obvious reasons didn't happen. We're obviously not completely out of the shadow yet of COVID, but we're glad we can make it happen. We're welcoming Jeremy virtually today, and he's going to give his lecture on the race of our lives. Jeremy is going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes. We're then going to have an in-person panel, which will respond a bit to his talk and the ideas in his talk, but also take questions with Jeremy during a panel discussion, which I'll moderate. And we've got three fantastic panelists that have agreed to participate. Here, we've got Richard Manley, who's the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Investing at the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, is that right? CPPIB, which is a 550 billion Canadian dollar asset owner. We have Irina Spazapan, is correct, right? Who is a partner at Systemic and runs Systemic Solutions, which I'm sure you'll hear more about. And then Anna Skarbek, who has flown in from yesterday from Melbourne, Australia, to do a variety of things, not just for this, but a variety of things. So thank you for, with jet lag, doing this. And then we're going to have a drinks reception. So Jeremy doesn't really need an introduction. You all know who he is. Suffice it to say, Jeremy, you are a globally respected investor and analyst. Some would even say you are an investment guru, or indeed their guru, on a variety of things. And of course, you're also a dedicated philanthropist who has given and is giving to a wide variety of important environmental causes around the world. So thank you so much for coming, and hopefully the IT works. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm starting my timer now.
Yes.
And let me say that I have studied stock market bubbles for 50 years, and I've studied climate change for 25 years, and I have been a complete nerd following the data on COVID for 2 years. And they all have one thing in common, and that is wishful thinking. And bubbles and climate and COVID dripping with wishful thinking. And let me give you an example. Nobody in Boston realized how bad Massachusetts was in the early days. If Massachusetts had been a separate country for the first year, it would have been the worst country in the world until finally Peru overtook us. And we thought we were doing pretty well. And the mayor of Boston bragged about how well they were doing, and the governor of Massachusetts did. And the press went along with it. Similarly in America, similarly in the UK, both did terribly, and both were allowed to get away with the idea they were doing pretty well. And the reason I begged off coming in the flesh is because I'm 83 and because I'm very well aware of the data. And this is the data. More Brits died last week than in any country on the planet. Now you tell me how many people in Britain realize that is the case. Check it in Statistica. They charge for their data. They've been pretty reliable, but all the data agrees. 500 approximately deaths a day is the worst in the world per million. That is quite remarkable, the gap between what Massachusettsians and Oxfordians think of real life and what it is. The central problem we face today on the planet is not climate change in isolation. It's the need for sustainability. Compound growth is simply not possible in any mathematical or physical sense. Yet growth at almost any cost remains our central objective. Had ancient Egypt compounded its growth at a miserably small 1% a year for its 3,000-year history, it would have grown by 9.2 trillion times. Amazingly, this can actually be checked in your iPhones these days, but not when I first said it. We're living beyond our means, and within 100 years at this kind of growth, we would need 3 planets or more to have any chance at sustainability. We must learn to settle for less, an argument even Greens hate to hear. We have to do that if we mean to leave a little bit for less rich countries and for our descendants. We deplete our very finite resources, generating waste and toxicity as we use them up. CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, our 3 main greenhouse gases, are just another waste product of our excessive growth. The position of us humans on our planet would be threatened even without climate change. With it, all our risks are enhanced, and these risks will increase and even accelerate unless we change our ways and change them pretty fast. Today, I'll talk about some of the connections between the main problems we face. A good place to start might be where my first installment of The Race of Our Lives began almost 10 years ago, the idea that nearly all civilizations failed. Historians have listed several major reasons for failure. They include overuse and mistreatment of natural assets, steadily increasing complexity that demands increased energy, and above all, hubris, a prolonged confidence that everything will turn out well because it always has, and that reckless growth can continue indefinitely. A lack of resilience at unexpected shocks, such as we have seen recently, both with COVID and Putin's war, is a typical late-stage warning. 10 years ago, I recommended an excellent book, the only one I've read 3 times in my life. It's very short and concise, I must admit. Immoderate Greatness by William Ophuls. He does all the necessary heavy lifting by summarizing all the great historians on this topic. His bottom line is that our current civilization, the first one to be truly global, checks off all 5 or 6 major characteristics of late-stage failing civilizations. In fact, he believes we are hardwired to self-destruct. My version of that point is that we Homo sapiens have been trained by the several million years of our species development to grow as fast as we can with no regard for the distant future, as does every other organism, from rats and lemmings to bacteria in the petri dish. Until, that is, they hit the limits of their resources and crash. Our current faith that our compound growth will continue indefinitely should not, in this context, be surprising, and nor should the crash of our particular civilization. I find Ophuls painfully persuasive, but I feel he might have missed two optimistic factors that really are different this time. First, fertility reduction. Malthus in 1798 never imagined for a second that we would en masse decide to have fewer children, despite becoming on average better off. Every developed country except Israel is now well below replacement level, and some like Japan, South Korea, and China profoundly so. You could say about long-term population reduction that it is not a sufficient condition to save our bacon, but it is absolutely necessary if we mean to have a decent chance of keeping a reasonably stable world. And the second condition that previous civilizations did not enjoy is our level of technology and its rate of change. Ophuls, by the way, would point out here that each important new wave of technology until now required, in its turn, much more energy and increased complexity, and therefore increased the long-term chance of failure, while encouraging short-term overconfidence. But I believe there may be some exceptions to his mostly valid point. There are a few get-out-of-jail-free cards that just may be offered. They are all possible sources of infinite or nearly infinite supplies of green, non-polluting energy. They include fusion, geothermal, and a major energy storage breakthrough to go with wind and solar power. Major breakthroughs in these areas in the near future would provide the energy to both replace carbon-based fuels and to extract the dangerous excess of CO2 in the atmosphere from a future peak of 500 or so parts per million back to 300, or around 3 trillion tons of CO2 needs to be extracted, perhaps with enough cheap energy left over to deal with global poverty as well, if we get really lucky. I'm going to read here a few paragraphs of The Race of Our Lives Revisited, written in 2018, to set the scene and save some time. Then I'm going to race through many exhibits, but they are simple and present just one idea each, and I'm going to point out that idea anyway, so don't panic. Along the way, I'll try and point out the 5 or 10 most important dilemmas, risks, and opportunities. 4 years ago, this was called a summary of the argument, and I am going to give you an extract of that. You could call this the story of carbon dioxide and Homo sapiens. You may not know, but if we had no carbon dioxide at all, the temperature of the Earth would be minus 25 degrees centigrade, a frozen ball with no life, with the possible exception of bacteria. That crucial 200 to 300 parts per million of carbon dioxide has taken us from that frozen state to the pretty agreeable world we have had for the last few thousand years. CO2 is therefore, thank heavens, a remarkably effective greenhouse gas. The burning of fossil fuels, which is the main cause for increasing CO2 and warming the world, has played a very central role in the development of civilization. The Industrial Revolution was not really based on the steam engine. It was based on the coal that ran the steam engine. For in a world without coal, we would very quickly have run through all our timber supplies, and we would have ended up with what I imagine as the great timber wars of the late 19th century. The demand for wood would have quickly denuded all the great forests of the world, and we would have returned to where we were at the time of Malthus, living at the edge of our capability, enduring recurrent waves of famine, along with every other creature on the planet. A few good years, the populations expand. A few bad years, we die off. A gallon of gasoline can do the equivalent to 400 hours of manual labor. And this extraordinary advance meant that the ordinary middle class had the power that only kings had had in the distant past. And what it did, this incredible gift of accumulated power from the sun over millions of years, was to create an enormous economic surplus that catapulted civilization forward in terms of culture and science. Above all, agriculture has benefited, allowing our population to surge forward. The sting in this tale, however, is that this has left us with 7.8 billion people. Last time I said this, it was 7.5, going on a predicted 10 or so billion by 2100. Such a large population can only be sustained by continued heavy use of energy. Fossil fuels will run out, destroy the planet, or do both. The only possible way to avoid this outcome is rapid and complete decarbonization. Needless to say, this will be extremely difficult to pull off. In theory, Homo sapiens can easily handle this problem. In practice, it will be a very closely run race. We should never underestimate technology, but also never underestimate the ability of us humans to really mess it up. Technology, particularly technology of decarbonization, has recently been trying very hard to help us. Technology, in my opinion, will in one sense win. If we're able to look ahead 40 years, I'm confident that there would be a decent sufficiency of cheap green energy on the planet. In 80 years, perhaps it's likely we will have full decarbonization. Lack of green energy will not be the issue that brings us down. If only that were the end of the story. The truth is we've wasted 40, 50, 60 years since the basic fact about man-made serious climate damage became known. We're moving so slowly, by the time we're fully decarbonized our economy, the world will have heated up by 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade, and a great deal of damage will have been done. Indeed, several tipping points are quite likely to have been exceeded by then, which will set off self-reinforcing negative effects that will be hard or impossible to stop. A lot more will happen in the deeper future due to the inertia in the environmental system. If we no longer produce even a single carbon dioxide molecule, ice caps, for example, will melt over centuries, and ocean levels will continue to rise by several feet. The most dependable outcome of increased temperature is increased water vapor in the atmosphere, currently up well over 4% from the old normal. This has led to substantial increases in heavy downpours. It is precisely the heavy downpours that cause soil erosion. In regular rain, even heavy rain, farmers lose very little soil. It's the 1 or 2 great downpours every few years that cause the trouble. We're already losing perhaps 1% of our collective global soil a year. We're losing about 0.5% of our arable land a year. It is calculated that there are only 30 to 70 good harvest years left, depending on location. In 80 years, current agriculture will be simply infeasible for lack of good soil. And this is without allowing for increased downpours. We must change our system completely to make it sustainable, which critically involves reducing erosion to zero by using no-till or low-till farming combined with cover crops. Because these are significant changes for a conservative community, it will take decades, and we have barely started. A subtext to all of what I have to say here today is that capitalism and mainstream economics simply cannot deal with these problems. Mainstream economics ignores natural capital. A true Hicksian profit requires that the capital base be left completely intact, and only the excess at the end of the year is a true profit. Of course, we have not left our natural capital base intact or anything like it. The replacement cost of the copper, phosphate, oil, and soil, and so on, that we use is not even considered. If it were, it's likely that the last 10 or 20 years, for the developed world anyway, has seen no true profit at all, no increase in income, but the reverse. Capitalism also has a severe problem with the very long term because of the tyranny of the discount rate. Anything that happens to a corporation over 25 years out doesn't really matter to them. Therefore, in that logic, grandchildren have no value. Corporations also handle externalities very badly. When they are not completely ignored, it is usually because of direct or implied pressure from customers collectively. We deforest the land, we degrade our soils, we pollute and overuse our water, and we treat air like an open sewer. And all of this is off the balance sheet and off the income statement. Worse, any sensible response is deliberately slowed down by skillful programs of obfuscation, well funded by fossil fuel interests and their allies. Finally, science speaks its mind. This is from the IPCC the other day. The cumulative scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of our planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Oh my God. This is aggressive. This language needs complete consensus of thousands of scientists and dozens of countries. What a strong statement that is. A livable future is not only at risk, but the window is closing rapidly. This is an enormous contrast to a few years ago. And this is 8 years ago. I managed to get a piece, remarkably, in Nature, addressed at wimpy climate scientists. Be persuasive, be brave, be arrested if necessary. It ends. This is not only the crisis of your lives, it's also the crisis of our species' existence. I implore you to be brave. They were truly wimpy, protecting the dignity of science, keeping their heads down, unwilling to exaggerate a problem in any form. And by understating, they in fact were increasing the risk. And that in the last 3 or 4 years, I'm happy to say, has disappeared completely. I simply could not aim that criticism at them today. This is the famous exhibit of Al Gore's, in this case extended to 800,000 years. And you see how the movement from a little under 200 parts per million to 300 made the difference between an ice age, 2 miles of ice on Manhattan, to the top where we had the interglacials and civilization in the last 12,000 years was allowed to develop. And then, bang, from 1950 until 2022, we jump up 418. Nothing like it has been seen, and it is straight up. And there is no way this will not go a lot higher. I think there is a respectable chance of keeping it below 580. But you see what a reckless, feckless experiment we're conducting with the stability of our global system. We have never reached 2 degrees centigrade in the last 3 million years. The chance of 1.5 degrees was lost 10 years ago. The chance of 2 degrees is going to be fought out over the next 10 years. The probabilities, I fear, are that we will sail through 2 degrees. This is the infamous increase in CO2, despite all the promises, commitments, and general chit-chat. We have never risen faster each year than we have done in the last three years. 2.5 parts per million per year is the recent rate. Just remember, step 1, the rate of ascent declines. Steps 2, it starts to actually fall. And step 3, it goes to nil. And we have not even covered step 1. This is the color coding of the climate improvements: deep red, hot, deep dark blue, cold. We have covered 1.2 degrees centigrade in 140 years. Until 2 or 3 years ago, when climate scientists, in a sense, woke up or found courage, They would not use the word accelerate, although the data was clear. I'm proud to say we did this exhibit 8 or 9 years ago. For the first 50 years, 60 years of the last century, we increased by 4 bips a year, 400ths of a degree. The second half, we went up by 17, and between the two recent El Nino peaks by 25. And things this dangerous accelerate, your hair should start to prickle. This is the acceleration clearly obvious in the heat of the ocean, which absorbs 93% of all the extra heat generated. And that results in a rapid sea level rise that you see here, which is also accelerating. This is from Nature Communications. On the left, it was their estimate, their old projection for 2050 for the Mekong Delta, one of the great rice growing areas. And on the right, their more recent one of 2 years ago, in which the whole Mekong Delta is underwater. It's already being saltified at a very steady rate. The real problem here, the people can migrate. The real problem here is the loss of the great rice growing areas. The Mekong Delta, the Nile Delta in Thailand, and the Brahmaputra, they're all, and Bangladesh. The great river basins are where a great chunk of the rice is grown, and they are all submerging. And food is going to turn out to be one of the central ideas where the most pain will be felt the most quickly. The dependable feature is heavy downpours. Here's just 3 inches in a day, which is pretty heavy. And you can see how steadily that trend is rising. Whether you use 1 inch or 10 inches, that applies. The floods in Germany last year were truly spectacular in the sense that they came close to washing away villages that had been there since medieval times without a problem. The idea here, you don't have to read this. What it says is that the damage from floods, droughts, wildfires, and extreme temperatures is not only rising, but tending usually to accelerate. And the numbers now are always in the tens of billions. Climate is close to tipping points. This is plagiarized from the Potsdam Institute, led by Johan Rockström, with his permission. And 9 of their 15 most vulnerable tipping elements are now on the move. Not only on the move, but close to tipping points. And this is their brilliant exhibit, which you can, in a sense, read at your leisure. But the Atlantic circulation in the middle, known as our jet stream, is causing all manner of problems because the Greenland ice, fresh water and cold water, is slowly but surely sapping its energy, and we don't know when it might click into another mode and leave most of Northern Europe extremely cold. Similar inflection points occur with the melting of the permafrost. A lot of methane, a lot of carbon dioxide is released, temperature rises, more permafrost melts, and so on. The boreal forests are drying out and the pests are taking over. The Amazon rainforest does not have a big safety margin before perhaps turning into savanna, and the great ice caps of Antarctica, which used to be thought safe behind their own system, are now at risk. This is, frankly, the scariest of all the exhibits. It shows in deep black in the middle those parts of the planet that are basically too hostile for human habitation already, and they're tucked away in the Sahara. The black hatch lines show what will be equally uninhabitable if we don't change our ways by 2070, a mere 50 years from now. The Sahara and the Saudi desert and parts of the Amazon are thoroughly inconvenient to nature, but not perhaps as desperately important to us humans. The real problem for us is the Indian subcontinent. Big chunks of that subcontinent will not be feasible for normal farming. And without normal farming and normal life, it means that the temperature and the humidity combine to make more than 3 hours fatal to a farmer. And even if we improve a bit, this kind of situation is likely to arrive before we turn the corner. India, I do not believe, has taken this on board. The only people who really process this data extremely well, in my opinion, are the Chinese. They know exactly what is happening and tend to act accordingly. Another great issue which does not get enough attention is the decline in the biomass of all natural creatures. 75% decline in flying insects in the famous German study. And it may not be that high on a global basis, but it is highly likely to be about 50% or higher. And E.O. Wilson, the great ant-man, he always said the world can live without humans, but it can't live without insects. Because what happens is a cascade where the birds that eat insects go out of business, and the frogs, etc., and reptiles that eat insects do also. And pretty soon, you can't depend on any part of the natural system, particularly including pollinators, which are already in terrible retreat. That commercial honeybees are beset on every side by chemicals and by mites and funguses. This is also, I think, the second scariest exhibit. This is one of the great agricultural counties of Iowa with some of the great soils of the world. In 1850, they had 14 inches, a magnificent surplus of soil. You need 3 or 4 inches. 3 is a moderate sufficiency for this heaven, and anything more than that is a reserve. 1900, 11.5, then 9.5, 1975, 7, 2005, 5.5. We found the people who'd done the work and tracked them down 2 years ago, 4.6 inches. What has happened here is you've gone from 10 inches of insurance to 6/10 of 1 inch. Erosion is happening more slowly now. They're aware of the problem, but it's still proceeding at half speed, and that is far too great as you approach 4 and then 3. And finally at 2, you cannot be commercial. This is this is not the kind of thing that comes from the one storm every 3 years, which can be 6 feet deep. This is following just your regular torrential downpour out in the Midwest. Another issue, hugely underestimated, is how we farm. There are 3 necessary fertilizers without which you can't grow anything. Nitrogen, which we produce by the Haber-Bosch process using vast amounts of natural gas, i.e. fossil fuels. And the other 2 are potassium and phosphorus. And these are rocks, and clear, as finite as they could possibly be. We dig them out, we put them in a ship, we sail them over to a distant country, we truck them to the farm, and we scatter them on the ground, often in China and the US in too great a quantity, and they become very vulnerable to the next storm or the next windstorm or the next rainstorm. And one of these 2 is 1/20th of the other. Phosphorus is a 20th in the Earth's crust as potassium. And 80% almost of that is controlled by Morocco. This is far bigger than OPEC in oil, and a single country. And if there is a revolution in Morocco, I will guarantee that the Chinese government and the US government and probably the European government will intervene within a week. This is another point I would like to hammer home, and that is the division in science between one specialty and another. This particular exhibit covers the division between soil scientists and climate scientists. The soil scientists with their dirty boots do not apparently talk or are talked to by the climate scientists. The climate scientists have decided that future climate change will enormously compromise the ability to grow food. Floods and droughts and higher temperatures, all of it make fertility harder to come by and reduce the size of the crop. The soil scientists know that erosion is doing the same. Nobody has put these two together, so this is the first time you have ever seen this exhibit. And regrettably, this would take us 56% below the previous existing trend. And I sincerely hope we can do better than minus 38 from 2020 level. I suspect we will, but I do not expect that we will see an improvement in productivity from here on out. The combined effect of climate and erosion is just too great. And the bad thing is, once again, the intersection. The climate increases the heavy downpours, which are a power law of erosion. And it is exactly those 10 inches a day that hit Houston and 23 inches in one day in Japan that will do multiples of the damage. This is my story of the devil and the farmer. The devil goes to a Midwestern farmer and says, I will give you 3 times the profit per year if you sign the contract for your soul. And these contracts always have footnotes, and footnotes 21 in this case is that they would lose 1% a year of their soil. And that didn't worry them because they knew they were losing that anyway, which they are. The present value of the deal with the devil was 5.6 million. 100 years later, there is no soil. It was a bargain, but the present value in year 100 is nil. And the poor farmer up the road who was too dopey to take the deal and whose present value was only 2 million, who's making do with 20, 30, 40,000 a year and has to take a part-time job to stay in business, the present value of his farm in 100 years, other things being even, would be exactly the same as it was at the beginning, 2 million. Every MBA ever minted would make the deal with the devil or fail the course. That is the trouble with capitalism. The good news in the remaining 10 minutes is renewable technology is also accelerating. Nobody, I mean, as in absolutely nobody in 2009 thought there was any chance at all that utility scale solar would come down from ludicrously expensive to much cheaper than coal. You can now build a solar farm or a wind farm and pay for it cheaper on an annual basis than coal if you give the coal plant and you only pay for the annual cost of the coal you burn and the plant is given to you, you're still underpriced by solar and wind, which will continue to get cheaper as time goes by. This is one of the largest solar farms in the world, stuck in the desert. 5 years ago, they had the record cheap 3.0 cents, and last year, a 1.0 cent. In other words, the cost in perfect conditions for producing without storage solar energy is approaching zero. A word on wind. Wind is very much the favorite in the UK. Offshore wind, you have some of the best resources in the world. In 2000, when you cycle past in Holland, you were cycling past a 2 megawatt. It's very tall and impressive, but it is in comparison to today's a toy. And today you are installing, as we sit, 12 megawatt turbines in the North Sea, and you are testing late this year 15 megawatt from Vestas and GE are out in the test, and they will put up their first test windmills before the year is out, which are yet another 20 meters higher. And 2 things you should know about a wind tower. Pi r squared When you go from 10 feet to 20, you don't double the wind, you quadruple it. It's equivalent to the area of swept by the blades. The other thing is, as you go higher, you pick up more wind, and the wind power is cubed. So 140 mile an hour hurricane is 65% more powerful than 120, not the 17% that it feels like. So monstrously tall wind towers floating in the ocean deep into the future, 20, 30, 40 years from now, are candidates, along with the desert and solar, to be the cheapest forms of energy available. Subject, that is, to potential breakthroughs in fusion and geothermal. The total wind energy has rocketed up. Every year, the energy authorities have underestimated the growth rate. But sad to say, it is still only the very tip of this problem. This is the glass half empty. Electric vehicles, as you can see, taking off. 125, 3,200, 6,700 last year, at 6.7 million. Tesla alone hit 1 million vehicles, and this is going to continue to explode. It does, however, come with some pretty decent sized problems to do with batteries and resources. A solid state, I'm happy to say Grantham Foundation has had a big investment in QuantumScape. A solid state reduces by half the weight, reduces by half the volume, and the materials used are substantially reduced. In a Tesla, you take a 1,000-pound battery, you make it 500 pounds, and you save 300 pounds of cooling equipment because solid state does not heat up the same way. With batteries that cheap, you open the way to have trucks, which I am very confident will be dominated by electric within 10 years. One of the problems, though, is that all we're doing is adapting the overweight, hefty vehicles. It is truly ludicrous to have a 5,000-pound vehicle carrying a 150-pound person around to play tennis. I mean, this is crazy. And this is the way we have to go. Ultra lightweight materials fed by solar power into solid state batteries. This one on the left that we invested in, had we been able to pull that off, we used less energy than you use to walk to the supermarket. Planes are a guarantee. We're investors in the one on the left. They will make it once solid state hits. They will have so many more degrees of freedom. They will go on the right-hand side from 9 passengers to 17. 60% of the weight of that machine is the battery. You can imagine what it means to have suddenly a pen come through that and say 30% of the weight. Shipping is a huge polluter, and many, many venture capital operators are working on that problem. This is one of my favorites, one of our biggest investments. This is going to produce biochar running across the cornfield, taking 40% of the stubble. You need to leave quite a lot. And through very high temperatures indeed, turning it into instant biochar. Instant biochar stays in the soil for hundreds of years, and by the nature of its dimple surface is a brilliant haven for bacteria and microorganisms to enrich the soil. Another of our investments, Greenlight Bioscience, a leader in RNA research, produced a killer of the infamous Colorado potato beetle. A gram in 2 gallons covers an acre and tells the Colorado beetle, and only that it can no longer process carbohydrates and they die of starvation. They are utterly non-poisonous, non-toxic. A whole new world for agriculture is opened. Another one of our favorite investments, nitrogen fixing bacteria, they usually stay alive for only a few hours, and our guys have found a way of supercharging so that they, at the moment, reach 2 weeks. And at 2 weeks, they can produce half the nitrogen out of the air that the plants need. And they aspire to 100. Steel is going to be carbon neutral with any luck, and carbon neutral cement also. Carbon negative, perhaps, if these guys get it right. Novacem. Skyscrapers will be made from wood. This is one already up there, 20 floors high, entirely timber. And materials, new materials from grown materials, cellulosic fibers at the nanoscale that can be made like carbon fiber 10 times stronger than steel. And many different kinds of biopolymers will be manufactured in the next 20 years. And the question is always, will it be quick enough to head off the problem? We will need to suck out at least 2 trillion tons of carbon dioxide. And that's why Grantham Foundation's portfolio specializes in direct investments in all different forms of sequestering carbon: biological, ocean, direct, and etc. And fusion, of course, would be like a gift from the gods. The power of the sun. There are at least 3 dozen, 4 dozen probably, new enterprises using state-of-the-art new technologies to try and end run the old monster research efforts that have been going on for decades and costing tens of billions of dollars. I am pretty confident that they will make it technologically. I am not as confident that it will be necessary, that they will be competitive with the solar, wind, and storage if we get lucky in storage and have equivalent major breakthroughs there. The Earth's crust, drill a few miles down. We've got enormous backlog of experience from fracking, lateral wells, and handling very high temperatures using steam to generate electricity. It is almost infinite. It would do extremely well. And perhaps, just perhaps, an inherently safe, small, modular, mass-produced fission reactor, the standard nuclear. I wouldn't hold my breath. The lithium-ion battery pack prices on the left, they wanted 1,100 a kilowatt hour. Last year, $130. This is not bad. This was the disappointing product. And there are new ingenious, this is our investment in storing water storage underground using water pressure, generating hydrogen using excess periods of green energy, and alternative battery technologies. This is one of our investments. I must say it's been thoroughly exciting, by the way. And as you get older, having a purpose is a very good idea. My time is up, but I've got 2 exhibits. This is just direct air capture. They're dreadfully expensive, but they are pushing forward. There is real commitment to climate change now from the Googles and the Facebooks who are buying the first tons at a decent price. Climate venture capital has exploded, as you can see. Multiples of the money pouring into green deals. It does have a problem. The energy intensity the mineral intensity up top of offshore wind goes all the way down to coal and natural gas. These green new technologies are using far more precious metals. We will need 40 times the lithium. And at the end of the day, sadly, in 2050, we are unlikely to need less than 40% fossil fuel still for our total energy, according to us. And we're reasonably optimistic on these topics. We believe in technology, but we don't see miracles. And 2 degrees centigrade is our best bet for what will happen by 2050. And we will struggle, fight, bite, and scratch to keep it below 3 degrees by 2100. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Jeremy. Now we're just getting the panel up on stage, and what we'll do is hear from Richard first, and then Irina, and then Anna. Give their reflections, reactions to your talk, and we'll have a Q&A and a bit of a discussion, and hopefully a vibrant one. So I want the audience to be thinking about questions and interventions and things you could be asking this fantastic panel. So Richard, over to you.
Says, note to me, don't follow Jeremy Grantham again. Thank you, Jeremy, for those remarks. And maybe just by providing a little bit of context, my job is to support Canada Pension Plan in integrating ESG into its investment process. Our mission is to support the fund's performance through doing that successfully. We don't do that because we have a moral or an ethical mandate to do that. The act of the CPP is to maximize returns without undue risk of loss. Prior to this role, I worked on Wall Street running one of the large investment banks' ESG franchise. I spent 15 years trying to persuade portfolio managers to take this seriously and decided in 2010 to rebrand what I did. I stopped doing ESG and started managing 21st century business risks. A lot of people argued with me as to whether it was even their job to integrate ESG into the investment process. I haven't found anyone yet that has argued the merits of integrating 21st century business risk into investing. A few things I'd like to say. It's not just about an energy transition, it's about a whole of economy transition. And importantly, we can talk about a transition, but a transition won't be enough. We need the optimal transition. The optimal transition is the one that removes the most greenhouse gases from the economy with the least impact to the economy. The Nudge Unit published a paper on the first day of COP outlining things the British government could do to change consumer behaviour. It vanished quite soon after. I think the conclusion was some of these initiatives might not be particularly socially acceptable. Even the IEA's net zero pathway indicated at the outset it was solving for social acceptance. One thing to consider from an econometric standpoint is that rewiring the economy, which is effectively what it means to re-energize the economy or transition it towards renewables, is not going to impact our models the way fixed asset investment ordinarily would, because we are substituting existing capacity with new capacity for no expansion in output. It is a massive reduction in productivity. And that, I think, is one of the challenges we see today when we talk about how we drive economic growth, how we sustain economic growth while rewiring, is that it's not quite as productive as it historically would be. The other point I'd like to make is this is not just about capital. There's a lot of focus on the role of capital in driving the transition, particularly since the announcements with respect to GFANZ last year. And the reason I say it's not just about capital is it's not just about decarbonising portfolios. It's very easy to decarbonise a portfolio, you just divest. Divestment, and I think Jeremy's outlined this very well, in all of the opportunities there are to actually finance the development of solutions to this, divestment is an active short on human ingenuity. If you sell the assets that stand to benefit from the technologies that Jeremy's just alluded to, you will effectively risk a situation where you have excluded assets that re-rate from your portfolio and don't capture the economic benefit of the innovation that's currently taking place. And importantly, decarbonising won't actually, or divesting from the portfolio won't fundamentally change the real economy, which is what we need to do to deliver the transition we need. There are 5 really important variables that investors don't control. And you'll see in the small print of the GFANZ, they make reference to regulation, but it's not just about regulation. It's about consumer behaviour. Everything that consumers do to change their behaviour, to make their consumption less greenhouse gas intensive, alleviates pressure on the rest of the economy. At the moment, we are not proving particularly responsive to the nudges that have been put in front of us. In fact, the IEA's own model assumes that smaller families will live in larger apartments requiring more heating and cooling, will fly further more often and ship things from further away. Okay? So the models at the moment are not assuming that the consumer will change behavior, but we need the consumer to participate in this transition to deliver the changes we need. The other thing is we need the technology, and I think Jeremy's outlined the technology. I'll leave it there. There's plenty of things to be optimistic about. We also need corporations to deliver upon their commitments. Now, we're seeing more commitments. I'll come back to this, but I'd say we have a long, long way to go to see corporate ambition manifest itself in corporate outcomes. One might say some of the net zero commitments are the mother of all IBG, YBG commitments. That's I'll be gone, you'll be gone. We actually need the generation of executives who are in situ today to be driving real-time decarbonisation of their portfolios where they can. The other two considerations to think about here then are carbon prices, an economic incentive to make better decisions, the development of market infrastructure around that, but also market infrastructure for corporate reporting. And lastly, we do need government ambition to increase and that ambition to translate into regulation. I'll note Jeremy said he's been focused on climate for 25 years. The UNFCCC was open for signatures 30 years ago. And in 30 years, if you reflect upon the amount of progress we've seen in international regulation, I think we need to see a lot more in the next 30 years, or this is going to be really tough. A couple more points from me. So what do we control? We control portfolio design, we control security selection, and we control our approach to active ownership. Active ownership, I think, is absolutely key in driving ambition to commitment. I think at the moment we see a lot of initiatives, bearing in mind, if you think about since the UNFCCC was open for signatures, we've basically had 23 years of inaction, and we've only really seen an acceleration in debate since Paris. So we've had 7 years of, I'd say, accelerating and more frenetic excitement about climate, but we really do need to see this translate into tangible action. One of, I'd say, my concerns as a species is we love to simplify. And the problem of oversimplifying climate is it creates overconfidence bias. If this was that simple, we'd have fixed it 30 years ago. This is really, really hard to fix. We now have over 2,000 companies have committed to net zero. To put it in context, that is the human equivalent of running a 1 hour 45 marathon. Nobody's ever done it. In fact, if I said today I'm going to run a 2-hour marathon, I'm pretty confident every one of you would immediately ask, Richard, what is your personal best? I'd have to confess I've never run a marathon, so 2 hours is going to be really tough. But for one moment, think how many issuers that have claimed they are going to get to net zero, removing 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions from their businesses in the next 28 years, how many have provided their personal best? And that is the amount they could remove now. And the answer, sadly, is none of them. So there really is a case here for reporting conventions to evolve. I don't want to make light of this. Decarbonising a portfolio, a company, developing a transition pathway for a company is the boardroom equivalent of eating an elephant. They do not know where to start. I'd say one of the biggest things we all need is to build capacity in boardrooms. It's for investors to be ensuring they're holding boards to account. It is the board that is accountable to the owner of the company to really ensure that management are getting their arms around the transition risks they have in front of them and building credible transition plans. Now, in that context, CPP published a paper on the first day of COP. We've left it on the internet, it's still there, proposing that all issuers now should conduct an abatement capacity assessment and attribute 100% of their current greenhouse gas emissions to one of 6 decarbonisation pathways. It can either be reduced through efficiency, through economic, today, a greening of power consumption, or through new investments that are economic under current regulation, current carbon prices and current technology costs. Just as the oil and gas industry is required to report its proven hydrocarbons, we believe companies should be calculating and reporting their proven greenhouse gas abatement capacity. We then propose that in order to simplify the probable, they keep regulation and technology unchanged, but apply shadow carbon prices of $75 and $150 a tonne to calculate their probable abatement capacity over the medium term, giving them the opportunity to indicate which of Jeremy's technologies they anticipate being able to apply to decarbonisation in the medium term. And lastly, that anything that is not economic at $150 a tonne, they explain what they intend to do with it. They either decommission it, they offset it, or they are holding out hope for some technology in future to facilitate decarbonisation. So as an investor, I do think we have a lot to do. I think providing capital to technologies that are going to support the transition is one. I think ensuring that all of our existing companies have transition plans to decarbonise to net zero as technology becomes available is two. And in order to achieve that, I think we must be seen and we must be active in holding our boards to account. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Richard. So, Irina, we've heard from we've had an asset owner perspective. You're a management consultant advising a lot of these tech companies. You have a venture capital arm, I think, at Systemic, and investing in some of them. So it'd be great to hear your views. Over to you.
Thanks, Ben. So I represent the investment side of Systemic. Systemic is a relatively young firm. It spun out of McKinsey 6 years ago. And it's in a very short period of time become possibly the leader globally as a pure advisory climate firm. And we go all the way from think tank work, which is where we work closely with Anna's organization, and advising corporates and investors, where I think that there's big interactions on Richard's side. I run the venture capital side of things, which obviously works closely with Jeremy's team, and we do a lot of things together. And like Richard, we spent a long time in the same Wall Street bank a long time ago. I equally grew disillusioned by this idea that it's all about the profit in the next 3 to 6 months, and it's all about where my next bonus is going to be paid, and how I'm going to explain to shareholders where the next cash is going to come from, completely ignoring these huge long-term transition issues, which is where the system still has an issue and hasn't really truly evolved, which is obviously linked to the much deeper issues in the financial system. But I guess the growth of venture capital, which Jeremy alluded to, is fantastic, right? Last year in what I do, which is the early stage of venture capital, we grew to 40 billion globally, which is still a drop in the ocean, but it's from pretty much zero after the boom and bust, which we experienced in so-called clean tech 1.0, which is what happened around solar panels and the first fuel cells between 2000 and 2009. That coincided with the boom and bust in carbon markets, which equally went from third to zero and then stayed there for a long time. So it is great to see what we're seeing now. But I would caution that if you take a pure technology approach, is let's invest into these great companies, and then you have late-stage capital, in the growth equity side, which looks to invest into whatever it might be, 30, 40, 50 million per investment. There is all the thing in the middle, where there is no capital, in particular around assets. Venture capital does not like steel. Steel does not have much value, right? Once you've built your first couple of plants, chances are that your fourth and fifth plant, which will then become the commercial one and the scalable ones, will apply very little of that steel that you've deployed early on, and that is not something that anybody wants to finance with equity. But that is not there to be seen, which brings me to the importance of government and policy, right? Very much from the start. We have companies in our portfolio that have incredibly benefited from having sort of the non-dilutive action of governments. Early on, when they really sort of can come side to side with the private capital, sort of to de-risk that early steel that nobody wants to have on their balance sheets, and then get them to a stage where the big private equities and sort of then financial commercial banks can take it on. So we, as Systemic, and Systemic Capital, which is the bit that I run, is really all about plugging these early technologies into this broader system, which is the policymakers and how we help the policy to set up the sort of policies of the future that will support these technologies in a in a coordinated way, right? So it's not about shooting at 20 birds, knowing that maybe one is going to kill one, but try to be a bit more focused and say, okay, these are the 3 things we really have to do as a country, and this is the timeline. Heat pumps now, long-term storage. If there's one, you cannot talk like that, but if there's one mildly positive thing about what's happening in the east of Europe, the tragedy over there is that it's just going to give a massive kickstart and boost to things that so far we didn't really have a reason to advance, right? Such as long-term storage and gradually getting rid of gas, which is the last of the 3 big fossil fuels that we have to decarbonize because it is the most, carbon efficient, maybe, right? Because nobody talks about methane emissions, which doesn't make it look that good. But that is going to kickstart technologies which have so far been in the drawer, we think, a lot faster. Equally, we all talk about energy and the dependence on gas, but people forget that there's places like Lebanon and Egypt that import close to 100% of their grains from Ukraine and Russia, right? So in a year's time, when we'll start having millions of refugees knocking on Europe's doors, then maybe the transition and the issues with the need to move towards more localized food systems and less land use intensive, that we think is going to be the next thing right on the agenda, which should get faster compared to sort of what we thought would happen 6 months ago. And so I guess the big message is that venture capital or any kind of asset in a vacuum is not what society needs, right? We need to be coordinated at Systemic. We try to load off of that, right? So that early stage people talk to late stage people, talk to venture, talk to governments, to NGOs, right? Because often NGOs are, especially in this sector, the NGOs are the one that set the platforms to tell the right stories, right? And equally, NGOs can kill somebody who does not tell the story in the right way, right? Because you'll find all sorts of possible externalities that then make it unappealable, right? So, and I'm not saying that you have to sort of twist the books to tell the right story, but I think I see a lot with our early stage companies, they ignore the NGOs. And this is not something you can do in our world. Academia, NGOs, it's very important, and the earlier you bring them on, sort of the better. And I think that's what we call fundamentally system change, which is the whole name that Systemic is for, right? And the society challenge, which cannot so possibly be just in a little silo, is what we've historically got wrong, right? And where we need many, many more systemics and many, many more people to work sort of together and try to advance this. Because time, we don't really have much time, right? And it's a bit sad that we'll get to 2035 and our only hope is going to be massive carbon removal because everything else we have exhausted, right? We might come to that, which is why we, like Jeremy's team, we do a lot around those technologies, but there's still time to do everything else, right? We don't necessarily have to go to the last possible technology. So that's.
Well, hopefully we'll have some time to come back to carbon removals, because there are lots of people I know here that have a research interest in it. But Anna, you are nurturing systems in Australia, but also further afield in different ways. Tell us more about that.
Yes, we do work with Systemic in a number of ways, because we've also internalised the systems change approach at Climate Works Centre, which works in Australia and across Southeast Asia with a team in Jakarta and working across ASEAN. And I began my career as an investment banker also, and worked in government policy when I realised that there wasn't yet the market conditions to allow all that talent and energy that the investment markets can harness to be harnessed towards solving for the externalities of environment and climate. And then following that time in government policy, worked here in London at what was then Climate Change Capital. And since over a decade now in Australia have been running this non-profit organisation that is hosted by Monash University. So we're a philanthropically funded version of a similar version to Systemic, solving for the net zero emissions goal and bridging the gap between research and action. So we're a non-academic team, but we act as expert advisors based on the evidence of net zero emissions pathways, which is really our starting point, which is of course the end point. When you backcast from the end goal and solve for it, you find yourself in the shared space, solving for the gaps that capitalism stops at the bridge of that central space, that the market has been designed to specialise in the bits you can control. The space that a company can of its own volition find its niche and grow. Yet this is the very definition of the shared problem. And so something that I'm observing that markets, all market participants, so that's the investors, the companies, their advisors, and civil society and governments, have yet to resource the time and the humans that it takes to create that shared marketplace for the problem solving. And where the capital comes from that is at the moment philanthropy and some of Systemic's clients, some of the multilateral donors and development aid, but it's not yet a skill set that's widely made its way into the private sector. And so I do think that will be a necessary skill set for modern investors to be the proactive investment attitude that you've so rightly described, Richard. It's a skill set that we can all learn, and indeed it's one that will allow us to achieve and solve for not just climate change but sustainable development goals, the art of collaboration. And when I think about it as a former investment banker, it is actually a skill set that investment already has. When you think about how do you close a successful transaction, you get paid on success, how do you attract the equity to a VC deal? If you are lacking something, if you don't have your debt piece, if you need some mezz debt because senior debt didn't want to come to the table, you go find the mezz debt because your client is the equity holder and you need to close that deal similarly. So actually we have the skill sets if we can choose to apply them in the shared space. And that probably means how do we resource that? How do we pay for that? Who's going to get paid on success? And so if we can redefine success so that the transaction doers will find that, well, government's not at the table. We don't have the policy that we need. We need the de-risked private finance. We need the blended finance, the public-private financing models. Oh, we need civil society to be not so angry about this. We need the unions at the table. It's actually what you might say traditional capitalism, if from the investment raising side and transaction doing, you could say those skills exist, but maybe the table wasn't as broad. You didn't need to bring all of those players to the table, but you do know how to bring players to the table when you want to close a deal. So applying that mindset to closing this deal, that is solving for net zero, can be done. How do we then pay for success? Well, you want to measure success. So we are getting better at measuring net zero. We're not quite done on the pathways and the trajectories, but certainly the expertise, the capability is beginning to be built. So the fastest that we can bring, Jeremy started his talk with data about the stock market, data about climate change, data about COVID. We are not far away. Certainly Ben's team have done a great deal of work in bringing the data on trajectories and emissions pathways and the data on emissions leakage and the data on asset level associations of emissions. That data is nearly visible. It needs a little bit more investment in making it more visible, but we are nearly there. Investors are demanding it. So we've got to accelerate. Where are those open source data platforms? When will it become ubiquitous on every Bloomberg terminal? When will it be ubiquitous in every, as you said, what won't be ESG, what will be ordinary investment analysis? We're not far off having it there. So accelerating the visibility of the data. We know how to measure getting to net zero. We know how to do it by sector. We know how to do it by company. So absolutely turbocharging the expectation that that should be everywhere means that we can then apply all the traditional skills we've spent the last generations getting good at. When you can measure profit, you solve for it, and the world got good at that. So we are nearly there to be able to measure emissions trajectories. So let's hurry up and get that baked into the system. TCFD is helping and TNFD is coming to address the natural capital gaps. My team have worked in Australia on measuring 4 ecosystem assets and 8 ecosystem services that pick up the pollinators, the soil quality, the water, and we've worked with the National Farmers Federation as well as the ag tech innovators, as well as the pension fund investors, and as well as the government owners of the data and the investors. in the Australian context, we've been able to do this, and we can now help feed that into the TNFD beta framework that's coming and how investors should measure natural capital at scale. We're all measuring the same stuff, right? Ultimately, there are 16 or 17 different ways of encouraging regenerative agriculture across Australia at that time, and rather than be the 17th, we did a convergence play, and that will happen globally pretty quickly. So the quicker that data becomes transparent, then we can encourage the behaviour that you talked about. The consumers will be more likely to use the nudge power when it's more visible, the apps and the consumer sentiment's there already. So turbocharging that with the information will make it much easier for consumers to apply that old adage of the standard you accept. The standard you walk past is the standard you accept. So at the moment we're letting everyone walk past it because we're not making the carbon visible in the supply chains. We're not far off that. And that will also then motivate the other behaviour around this collaboration. How do you move beyond the bit you control into that shared problem-solving space? Well, when you're all solving for net zero because your investors are demanding it and so are your consumers, then if government's missing from the table, investors, consumers, their advisors help bring government to the table rather than expect that someone else will. There is no other. And I think that will be a new skill set as well for the private sector, to be much better at not just waiting for government to come to the table, but helping teach government what's the best way to do advanced market commitments, what's the best way to do the de-risking. And that takes more time. Investors will find that you'll be resourcing your people to spend quite a bit more of time in that bridge between research, investment and government. And that is all alongside the next 8 years of effort of building twice the scale of electricity generation that we have today in the market. It's an enormous scaling task. But I think you're right to focus on behaviour, and I think the private sector has more of the behavioural elements in their toolkit already than realised, but it's time for it to cross the threshold from private into the shared space and realise that that's now all of our, that should be the domain that we're all operating in, to bring in the civil society with research and government. Otherwise, we'll have no shared space left because we will have closed the window to create a safe climate future for us all.
Indeed. Thank you, Anna. And I'm really glad that you're picking up on these points around systems change and how we can achieve it and the multidimensional nature of it. So I'm going to open it up now for questions. So if you could say who you are and your affiliation before your question, and if you want to direct it at somebody specific, please do so. Nick.
Ben, we've got a handful of
Oh.
questions.
Sorry, okay. So Nick and then the gentleman next to Nick.
Great. Nick Maybe from E3G. Thanks for the really interesting talk. But, just the last comments were quite micro in terms of individual firms or sectors or behaviours. But Jeremy started very macro with bubbles and systemic risk. So what else do we need to do than just put carbon or transition plans into individual firms to make sure we can actually drive a massive change and transformation of investment and sectors when we know the fundamental system is volatile and getting more volatile, and there will be booms and busts throughout this period. So it can't just be individual firms, there must be something at that systemic level. Particularly interested in Jeremy's thoughts as someone who watches that volatility, because the IMF and others are looking for a macro plan as well as a micro plan. How do we make sure we have the context in which you can invest when we're in the middle of a debt crisis out of COVID, another one out of Ukraine, which is also going to get, for most of emerging economies, in the way of this transition?
Great, thanks, Nick. And there was a guy next to you who had a question too. Let's take the other.
Which way?
Hi everyone, I'm Colin Besance. I'm leading the African energy transition work at PowerShift Africa, which is a think tank based in Nairobi. My question is about equity, but you'll forgive me, it's the fairness kind, not the investment banking kind. And it's a question about where and how this technology is distributed. So if we take for a given that a lot of the technologies that Jeremy told us about in the beginning, which seem really exciting, if we take for a given that some of them will come to fruition, a bunch of them will work, and will at least address climate insofar as, the species of humans continues to exist, I'd be interested in what the distributional consequences of that look like. So in Africa already, as you've mentioned, we're home to a lot of the critical resources that are funding or fueling a lot of the transition that we're speaking about. When we look at green hydrogen, the EU's plan is to build out massive green hydrogen in Africa, but primarily for export to the EU, of course. And so I'm interested in where you see the political dimensions behind a lot of this transition. Is it a separate question that needs to be answered in a separate space? Is it a political problem for civil society to address? Or is it something that we can bake into the way that we think about these investments from the outset? Is the fairness in distribution, in ownership, in who gets included, in who these resources are for, is that something that can be built in to the way we think about those investments from the outset? And if so, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how best to do that.
Great, thank you, Colin. Okay, so Jeremy, a couple of things directed at you. So do you want to respond to, particularly to the macro-micro point that Nick was mentioning, but if you've got thoughts on distributional challenges and opportunities?
I have to beg that I have become, for a couple of years, a specialist in micro. And it's taken more than all my energy, in the sense I feel I do several jobs badly. And I used to be a generalist in the financial business, in the stock market business. And I've completely given that up for the duration. While we tried to prove that a philanthropic organization could become a driver of technology and capitalist technology, if you will, by using our principle not to run an ordinary diversified portfolio, but a portfolio drenched in venture capital and predominantly green venture capital. So I am so up to my eyes in small-scale green VC that I am sadly incapable of doing justice to either question that needs more interaction between government, corporations, and investing.
Does anyone want to come in on any of those 2 points? Quick. Go on, Richard. Have a go.
So with respect to the first question, I have to say I'm really excited about the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I think when we talk about the concept of financed emissions, there's a lot of companies that are emitting today that haven't raised capital for 100 years. But they all have revolving facilities and they all engage with the banks about liquidity. And I think there is our underlying hypothesis over the medium term is that companies who are unable to transition at least as fast as their industry will lose access to capital. But I think at the moment we're not yet seeing the conversations that are taking place in the equity market take place in the debt market. And I think the opportunity for credit investors to actually engage in a conversation with the borrower about your current climate strategy is inconsistent with having access to my balance sheet. If you seek access to my balance sheet, I expect to see climate governance, baseline greenhouse gas emissions, short and long-term greenhouse gas reduction targets, this projected abatement capacity reported in the public domain. And without access to, and without the provision of that, you will lose access to capital. That is an important way of tying some of the macro and micro together. Because until I'd say we see system-wide reorientation of how we allocate capital to consumers of capital, it'll be very difficult, I think, to meet the macro outcomes we need with the micro behavioural changes we need. On the point on equity, it's really important that I think there's two things. One thing massively in emerging markets favour is the ability to leapfrog. And we've seen certain emerging markets, avoid the brain freeze of building infrastructure because they've been able to go mobile straight away. They've been able to build distributed power generation capabilities straight away. They haven't had to contemplate, some of the infrastructure that costs billions and has massive embodied emissions associated with it. So I think one opportunity here is if you seek as a capital provider to really drive change, we are building more in the emerging markets than we are in the developed markets. If there is a case for deploying green steel and green concrete, it is in the emerging markets. Now, if that is additional As in, if that would not take place without the support of international capital, I do think there is an opportunity to look at these investments as, methods for foreign capital providers to actually generate some offset. And I think, conclusion of Article 6, the ability here to start to transfer some of these credits between individual countries and DCs, will be one mechanism to ensure that capital providers and capital consumers who are willing to move forward with investments that are, justifiable only by virtue of additionality is, I think, an opportunity in the near term. But I think to Aruna's point, it won't take a lot to scale these technologies. Rights law is coming to all of these technologies. It did to everything that Jeremy alluded to earlier on. We won't need to go, I think, too far into scaling this before it starts to pay for itself. And then it'll be the easiest choice to make. And emerging markets will have access to green and low carbon steel and low carbon cement, I would hope, much sooner than many anticipate today.
But just a very quick follow-up to Colin's question, because I know I can sense that he's not going to be satisfied with the answer so far, which is that, do you as CPPIB, or do you know of other investors that really take account of the distributional challenges associated with net zero investing? I don't think I am, to be honest. I'm not aware of any asset owners or asset managers that really think fundamentally about the distributional implications of investment decisions they're making of the kind that Colin's alluding to. Am I wrong?
I think to date we are probably more viewing it as an investment risk rather than investment opportunity. But I think over time we may need to adopt a more positive take on that.
I might also give an example. I actually think the two questions are linked. That if we fail to take account of distributional equity, we will create systemic volatility. And I think we've learned that the environment movement have learned it in a 2 steps forward, 1 step back type of, lessons learned the hard way. Can we get there? Goes back to how quickly can we define the end goals with clearly enunciable expectations, so quantifiable emissions pathways. How can you add equity and justice into that in the way that we're looking at natural capital can now begin to be quantified? How are we looking at, just as we have done with other ESG risks, essentially what become minimum standards of acceptable definitions of investment criteria. Pleasingly, I think we are seeing a race to the top on integrity, at least for institutions that face external pressure, whether it's shareholders, consumers, and so that's the way in for that. Just as we've seen with modern slavery legislation, just as we are seeing in the Australian context, and we're seeing it globally with international offsets, and so the place to go is to continue that momentum and be able to define those expectations as investment criteria that then become a binary threshold before you proceed, and then I think that we will continue to see that, and that would be how you'd want to continue to avoid one sense of systemic volatility. On the how it's done, we're seeing some investors in Australia take account of regional distributional equity, so particularly where we're exposed to heavy emissions intensive geographic locations, where there are ports that purely export coal at the moment, for example, where there are towns that only build carbon intensive metals, for example. Investors in Australia are taking significant interest in the social equity elements of the transition and looking at embedding that in their expectations of the transition plans and also in their work with policymakers.
And I would add also that, maybe this is somehow controversial, but net zero can be very dangerous as a language, right? Especially for emerging markets. I'll come to that. I prefer to talk about net positive. And the reason I say it's dangerous is because net zero incentivizes to say, oh, I emit 10 million tons a year. Let me go and find the cheapest credits out there so I can offset that. And chances are that those are going to be like the crappiest, non-additional credits out there, which often generate from emerging markets, not always, often. And that just destroys the credibility on and on and on, right? So I think that there are some technologies like mobility comes on top, right? Where emerging markets is even more interesting because the issue with congested cities are way bigger in the African cities than they are in the West. Countries like India, China, they will be the green steel and green concrete, as Richard said, right? So that's super interesting. But I think if you look at the poorer segments, right, which I guess you alluded to, no startup, right, no company is, I guess, ever going to become a unicorn, a multi-billion company by serving the poorest segments of society, right? There's exceptions, like M-Pesa, right? You have exceptions more on the telecom side. Why not? They could be on the mobility. But I guess if you try to merge the net positive and the net zero language, I think that we will need to move away from this idea that you can minimize everything on carbon and look at SDG credits, right? You might have a project somewhere that is not very good on offsets, but it's amazing for the local indigenous community and generates a ton of social benefits. So why do I have to minimize those social benefits to offsets, which makes it liable to NGOs then, shutting it down when you don't have to, right? And this is very difficult because it took so long to come to a world where we finally understand carbon. But I just don't see how, you think that, there's lots of people, and we have this debate in Systemic internally, this is not the view of Systemic, on the contrary. There's lots of people that have this view, we're going to get to this jurisdictional credit, and it's going to create all this wealth, to countries that reside on biodiversity. I actually think it's the opposite, right? Because you just muddle the waters and you talk something apples when in fact it's potatoes.
Okay, so I'm conscious of time. We're going to take a batch of questions. Yes, lady in the middle.
I'm Manasi. I'm a PhD student at University of Sheffield and at the Grantham Center for Sustainable Futures, and I'm working on computational chemistry for water treatment. My question to all panelists is, often we see there is a difference in financing the mitigation activities and the adaptation activities. So how do you see the future, and where does the future lies? And another specific question to the responsible mining activities for the technological developments. So how do we see if there is any control over the mining activities, and are the actual sufferers, are the beneficiaries of these technological developments? So that's where open to discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Billy over there, if you could pass the microphone.
Billy Swede. I'm head of climate risk for Barclays. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit myself to one, and I'll catch you guys over dinner. So one for Jeremy. You're obviously very well known for your approach, your disciplined approach to valuation in your investing, and not going for the fads. I'm very interested, given that this very micro space you're now involved with is very much about technological change and stuff that is speculative, I guess, when it comes to its prospect. So I'm interested to understand how you use your valuation discipline and what that means in the context of the new kind of investments you have been focusing on more recently.
Thanks, Billy. And then Charlie at the back. Sorry about the passing of the microphone, but we're getting there.
Thank you. My name's Charlie Wilson from the Environmental Change Institute here at Oxford. I wanted to ask a question about consumer behaviour. It's come up in passing, but the discussion's really largely been about energy supply decarbonisation and carbon dioxide removal. Consumer behaviour ultimately in this context is about demand for energy and resources, and you've largely characterised this as being sort of exogenous or as a given. The recent IPCC report emphasised that tackling demand for resources could help reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 70% in end-use sectors, so buildings, transport, food, and industry. Some of this is about sort of social and cultural change, but actually much of it is to do with enabling infrastructure and also technologies available to consumers. So from an investment perspective, what opportunities do you see to proactively shape consumer behaviour while to reduce demand for resources?
Great, thanks, Charlie. So, Anna, I'd like you to answer the last question from Charlie. Jeremy, there's the validation question from Billy. There's also an adaptation question that I'd like you to answer, Jeremy, if possible, which is basically, and I think this is sort of part of your question, which is, you're basically telling us we need to adapt that we're going to have quite likely have 3 degrees of climate change. What do we need to do? What should we be doing to adapt? So Jeremy first.
The question on investing. Yes, doing venture capital is entirely different from any kind of investing really that I've done before. I've always felt that value had nothing to do with ratios like price to book and price to earnings. It always should be an attempt to estimate the distant future and discount it at a satisfactory discount rate, etc. And the quality of management, of course, is a vastly bigger issue when you're setting up a new enterprise. And we will really not touch anything that doesn't, if it works, it has to be capable of making a fairly profound change. And if it gets over that hurdle, as a philanthropic organization with a mission, we can take failure and still feel pretty good about it, as if we have given a grant for research. If it might move the whole field forward, even though our specific investment may fail, as opposed to a commercial portfolio, we can feel we've done our job. And let me just say that I think it is the first have your cake and eat it situation I've ever come across in my life, that when we look for the dollar that will move the cause of looking after a planet that needs greening badly, here's a situation where a venture capital investment in a brilliant new idea is probably the best money spent, whether it's a grant or an investment. And the investments actually recycle back into the foundation and back again and again if you view it as 100 investments. And that is unique, of course, and very hard for a grant to compete with. And so let me say the analysis is different. It's more people intensive. It's the long range quality of the idea. And seen through my eyes, a willingness to tolerate failure at a much higher level, and recognize from the start that it's not an entirely a capitalist enterprise. It's a hybrid where we are attempting to make as much money as possible to grow the foundation and simultaneously drive the research forward to result in a planet that can make it. And I'm afraid that isn't entirely useful, but that's all you're going to get.
And Jeremy, how about the adaptation question? Can you speak to that?
I don't think I can really. At least I feel I have nothing particular to offer. In terms of what we need to do, it's pretty simple. Everyone needs to do everything that they can. Speaking for myself, everything we can beg, borrow, and steal has been thrown into this battle. I don't even see it as philanthropic. I see it as defending the well-being of my grandchildren and their grandchildren. And I just feel everyone has to be exhorted to recognize that this is not business as usual. This is not investment banking. This is not building portfolios. This is our survival.
Anna?
Oh, I'm excited to answer Charlie's question. My response on the adaptation question goes to your reference to SDG credits. I think we're not there yet, but it can quickly, in the way that it can quickly become so essentially, if we get good at solving for net zero, it's not that much harder to solve for multiple SDGs at the same time. And at the moment, the adaptation, if you like, movement is a little further behind. Just as we saw natural capital was, and biodiversity was decades behind in terms of having how many COPs they've had and so on, and it's catching up fast. I think we'll see the same, because we will run out of time to be able to, we can't do them linearly. And it will become, again, killing multiple birds with one stone. So it's about the adaptation sector racing to be able to define those outcomes and goals alongside the investment goals of climate, and you can then combine them in policy and in infrastructure investment and the like. So I'm looking at just applying a similar set of tools and therefore learning to speak that sort of language to make adaptation investments be able to run in parallel with mitigation and natural capital investments. On the demand side question in particular, we have spent a lot of time looking at this, and with the systems change lens, the focus on consumer behaviour leads us to look at how do you achieve shifts in consumer behaviour at scale. And traditional approaches, again, you need every trick in the book, but many of them start with the understanding the behavioural science of the consumer. But there are, in relation to energy use, some systemic ways to achieve it through the supplier of the energy. So you mentioned infrastructure, and much of demand side use of infrastructure of energy is met through either residential or commercial appliances, plus the grid management that comes with that. And so if we're silent as investors on the shared infrastructure space of, are we requiring that domestic batteries have two-way software that can communicate with the grid manager? Are we setting and mandating expectations that these appliances be able to be operated so that they are part of the energy management grid? Are we looking at car batteries as in fact part of the energy grid system? And so they may happen to provide mobility services while actually providing storage function rather than looking at the other way around. That we're not there yet in that approach. But when you take a systemic approach to demand management, you don't need to begin with the end user consumer. You can actually look at the energy system and design it for a fully decentralised, fully decarbonised market. But those models don't exist. Our grid managers are running blind at the moment. They're not empowered with a pricing model and a minute-by-minute or 5-minute clearance, 30-minute clearance energy management model that starts from the end goal of a fully decarbonised energy management system that assumes every household and vehicle is decarbonised also. We haven't actually empowered our governments and our energy management systems or our consumer marketers with what that looks like. So we've got a bit of a race to catch up on the research side. And then on the financial modelling side, actually the financial products haven't yet evolved to flip from opt-out to opt-in. So the other way around. So we know behavioural nudges are powerful if we can take the onus off the consumer. You know, that's how we get long-term savings. It becomes the default option and you've got to actively opt out. With financial products, with the debt market, with mortgages, there is some hesitation at the moment in regulated industries such as finance around what you can impose on a consumer. So we've got to unpack some of these paradigms about the primacy of consumer choice, because at the moment we're assuming that it's the right outcome is that the consumer chooses the unhealthy option or chooses the high emissions option. Whereas at the moment we know there's power if in fact every mortgage was starting with the additional capex that came with decarbonising the home, for example. That's not yet the default market offer. There isn't yet a set of financial products that makes that easily accessible. But the lowest cost way to achieve demand side energy management would be to look at the intermediaries that we can access at scale. Utilities, telco, and energy management utilities all have retail customer relationships, for example, and usually at scale. So we're not yet creating the default offers that assume decarbonisation is the market standard. And that's another way to look at how you achieve consumer nudge from a systemic approach alongside the consumer end user perspective and run them both in parallel.
So we're definitely now in a quick fire round. So Richard, very quickly, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was going to add one point to this question here about how we impact demand. I think a massive issue is actually just accounting. And I'll just give you one example. 40% of emissions of the built space. When we're building infrastructure, we capitalize the financial investment and amortize it over the life of the asset and consequently kill ourselves to drive down the amount of capital we need to invest. What would happen, therefore, if we capitalize the embodied emissions And instead of leaving them on the balance sheet of the cement and steel companies as the project was being built, stapled it to the asset and amortized it on the consumer of the assets, scope 1 emissions over its life. Because at the moment, if you do that, you basically then get the tenant or the operator of the airport or the port to actually say, well, wait a minute, time out here. I need you to drive down these scope 1 emissions. I need you to actually go and get the green steel. I need you to go and get the green cement, because I need this built at 500 kilos a square meter rather than 2 tons a square meter, because I'm going to have to own that and wear it. And actually this becomes part of my transition commitment for the next 50 years, given the nature of some of these long-lived assets. So in part, I actually think some accounting incentives could really transform both corporate and consumer behavior here by educating them as to, frankly, how to make better decisions.
Okay, thanks, Richard and Anna and Jeremy. Last batch of questions, maybe those three, very on that side, yes? Those three, so James, Mike, and the gentleman over there.
Hi, it's Mike Wilkins from the Centre for Climate Finance and Investment, Imperial College Business School. My question goes back to one which was asked by the lady over there, really back to adaptation, and the title of this lecture, Race for Our Lives. About 95% of this conversation has been focused on mitigation. Actually, probably 99% has been focused on mitigation and hardly touched upon adaptation at all. And if what Jeremy said, is true, and I think most people believe that we are in a race for our lives here, then why aren't we talking more about investing in adaptation, in crop-resistant yield, crop-resistant, heat-resistant crops and drought-resistant crops, that's what I meant, and resilient infrastructure and all the other adaptation capital investments that are required to protect society and humanity against the impacts of severe climate change. Why isn't that being talked about in the investment context?
And questions need to be brief, sorry.
James Holt, Hindsight Consultancy. Just thinking about the radical innovation that we need here, is this all coming from early stage companies? Is this just a great venture capital opportunity? I mean, clearly it's where Jeremy's focused. And what, therefore, is the role of the incumbent? Is there any space for them to innovate? I mean, obviously they're not going to do the radical innovation that destroys their own business models, because that's just not how companies work. But do they take up all of these great new ideas and everybody lives happily ever after? Or are the incumbents kind of finished and the new business models will take over?
James, final question.
My name is Patrick Truman. I work at James Hambro and Partners, an investment firm. My question comes back to this idea of accounting, because it feels to me, and you talked, Anna, about transparency, that there's this gap at the moment still. And a lot of companies are able to put out a net zero commitment, but we don't actually know what that means. And I'm just wondering how we really close that gap so that investors have got real data and can vote accordingly on actual sort of measurable targets.
Out the Transition Plan Task Force that was launched today. Google it. Okay, so last set of responses. Jeremy, you get to go first. Pick up on whatever you'd like, and then the rest of the panel will.
Okay. In terms of adaptation, our VC unit is 100% into carbon sequestration. In other words, we recognize that we have to get back to 300 parts per million. We're already at 418. We're going to 500, maybe 550. One of the few things that is absolutely certain is that however successful we are along that path and however quickly we get there, we are going to need to take carbon out of the atmosphere if we mean to have a reasonably stable, successful system, natural system and economic system, social system. And so everything we're doing is aimed at that. I consider it all adaptation rather than mitigation.
And Jeremy, how about the incumbents and their role in all of this?
I have spent the last 10 years in particular becoming increasingly disillusioned by the state of modern capitalism. I describe it as fat and happy. and not doing enough basic research, waiting for the VC companies to develop, and then buying out the successful ones as a capital transaction, easy, not much career risk, rather than doing it yourself, risking income and losses and uncomfortable facts that can go wrong and bite you. And I understand it, but it's chicken and it's counterproductive, and it accounts for the fact that the capex and the research dollars from the incumbents have dropped, leaving a bigger load for venture capital. And I would point out COVID and the vaccination. What a remarkable event that has been, not talked about enough, that the two people who came up with the really successful shift in the vaccination strategy were Moderna, a Boston-based enterprise that didn't have a single drug certified, and the Germans, or Turkish Germans, whatever we want to call them, a married couple who did the same. Why? You know, the drug companies have charged the earth in America, and the logic is always, oh, because of all the incredible, valuable research we do. But they only do valuable research when they can make a killing. In things like vaccinations, etc., and antibiotics that don't typically make a fortune, they don't do much. And so we had to fall back on two venture capital operations to save the day. Really quite remarkable.
Lots of nodding.
The prices of power in the Netherlands this week went negative, right? So there's all this talk about costs of energy higher, which is true, but there's also opportunities in that. And where are the incumbents? Absent, right? If you look at this country, the only utility that offers the kind of tariff that would allow to capture, these half-hourly negative prices is Octopus, which, has completely wiped off the others, right? And it's the same if you look at any other European country. So they will come and buy, if you took carbon removal again, we believe, even if you take 2 billion tons of CO2 removed by 2050, we think it's going to be higher than that. That is still 4 times the entire oil and gas output, which is about 500 million tons a year, right? Where is that innovation going to come from? Certainly not from BP and Shell and Exxon. They will buy it, and then once it becomes about international logistics, then they will be able to operate it. Unfortunately, I would agree with Jeremy, right? The role of incumbents is maybe to watch and buy, right? Because they've been utterly unable to generate innovation internally. And I think on adaptation, I think it's very simple. It's very difficult to make money out of that, right? For mainstream investors. We invest a lot in data that make you understand what the physical risks are, which is a form of adaptation. So you understand what the stranded assets are, and then you sort of twist, then clients of our companies that understand how to twist their portfolio in reaction. But, if you invest into ways to stop bleaching the corals, increasing, the sort of the walls that go to the sea, so you don't have as many floods. That is very difficult for a private investor to make, 10-15% IRR out of that, right? It's again, it's more of a government. I think there are some adaptation. From what I can see, it's really in the data field. I can't think of something, in the deep tech world, other than carbon, stuff to do with carbon and methane removals, that would be an obvious investment opportunity.
If I can, on adaptation, we now require our deal teams to present not only a base case, but a 2-degree or cooler and a 4-degree or warmer bookend scenario. And as soon as Jeremy touched on earlier, one of the problems we have here is this dilemma of duration, that the present value of the transition risk always looks larger than the present value of the physical risk, so the physical risk is de-emphasized. But the evidence would suggest that may not be correct. But as soon as you start to say, hey, this is the cost of this physical risk when it presents itself, and this is the potential cost of adaptation, then I think you're able to have a conversation about ultimately how much do I have to invest to insulate my investment from this impairment. And I think at that point you can start to make a lot of these investments make more sense, but only if you're requiring your investment teams to look at what 4 degrees or warmer looks like I think, will you actually internalize, the scale of the risk that they need to go away and manage. And on the point on data, there is currently a live SEC consultation underway, a live ISSB consultation underway. There will be a European EFRAG consultation underway. There's proposals from all three as to what the future of corporate climate reporting should look like. If you're not happy with what we have, I sense that is the consensus. Lean in very hard in response to those consultations and outline what it is you feel we need. Because I think these three consultations are a once-in-history opportunity for market participants to provide feedback to regulators and standard setters as to what we need to facilitate efficient capital markets going forwards.
Last words for you, but very briefly, because we've got to wrap up.
I might just endorse the points about adaptation and the link between COVID and the value we placed on public investment in data as well as private. And I think that the data will empower. The private sector can demand and therefore fund the data by insisting on those scenarios. What does the hotter climate mean? So in our agricultural work, we have helped rebuild Australia's models of sustainable land use, including climate refugia. So where would species survive, essentially, as the temperatures rise? That wasn't mapped in our country. And so philanthropy is funding the mapping of that. And if you think about COVID and how thankful we were to have public health departments and all that epidemiological data that helped us manage responses as well as the vaccine, we're going to need to privately demand that data and also publicly ensure that it's invested in as one turbocharger. And we haven't got time to discuss the many others, but I think relying again on insisting on the data and embedding it in your expectations of what you need is a powerful way to start.
And a little plug for Oxford on data and COVID, our World in Data, based in Oxford, the Blavatnik School COVID tracker, obviously as well as a vaccine. So lots of good stuff going on in this place. Anyway, a wonderful lecture, Jeremy, a wonderful panel discussion. We scratched the surface on just on a few things, lots of things we're going to talk more about, I hope, over drinks and canapes. There are a few thank yous, though, I want to give. So the first are to the team, Artie and Alex in particular, that have been diligently taking RSVPs and organising the venue and doing all the hard work that's required to make these things a great big success. There's also the AV team as well, so thank you to all of those guys. I'd obviously like to thank the panel. Thank you for stepping up. And finally, I'd like to thank Jeremy. Thank you for giving us your time. Okay, so drinks and canapes are that away. Okay, cool. Jeremy, thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good time.